Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of the vanishing witness Father Brown feared, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K., Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. You're keen. Eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. Father Brown hunts the vanished witness. They found her shoe still warm, but the foot inside it was gone. The word struck like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples of dread through the smoky air of the tavern where Father Brown sat. Outside, the rain battered the cobblestones in a steady, merciless rhythm, as though it were counting down to some unseen deadline. A missing witness was nothing unusual in the grim tapestry of crime. People vanished, people hid, but the witness in question had been standing in the magistrate's hallway only minutes before she disappeared. One moment alive, breathing, arguing in her sharp, high voice. And the next, nothing but the faint smell of violets lingering in the air, and that shoe toppled on its side like a careless afterthought. Father Brown listened without blinking, the firelight casting a gold halo against his worn cassock. His round face unreadable. He knew the woman's testimony was the final thread keeping a man named Horace Elmsworth from walking free. A man whispered about in the same tone villagers used for curses and unclean things. But as he sipped his tea, his mind caught on something no one else seemed to notice. The detail about the shoe being warm. Warm despite the icy draft from the open hallway window. It wasn't right. It wasn't natural. The constable, red-faced and impatient, had muttered about kidnappers. Others blamed the accused's rough friends. But Father Brown had already decided that if this was abduction, it was a performance. A spectacle designed not just to remove the witness, but to unsettle every single person who had seen her last. Whoever had taken her wanted them all tangled in doubt and fear, a net of confusion from which the truth could not easily escape. That night, the priest walked the rain-slick streets alone, retracing the route from the magistrate's hallway to the witness's lodgings. It was late enough that most curtains were drawn, but here and there, a sliver of lamplight revealed faces pressed to the glass, eyes watching him with unspoken suspicion. He stopped once under the shadow of a crooked sign for a shuttered bakery where the smell of violets drifted past again, faint, almost imagined. He turned sharply. The alley beyond was empty, except for a smear of something pale on the wall, high enough that a woman's head might have brushed against it. When he reached the boarding house where she had stayed, he found the front door unlocked, as if someone had left in a hurry. Inside, the place was silent. Too silent. The wallpaper was peeling in damp curls, the carpet worn thin in a path toward the staircase. On the table in the corner sat a teacup, half full, the liquid cold but not yet congealed with scum. She had been here recently, very recently, and yet the chair was tucked neatly under the table, her shawl folded precisely over the backrest, as though she had prepared for a polite departure, not an escape. Halfway up the stairs, Father Brown paused. Something on the third step glinted faintly in the dim light. He stooped and found a pin, plain, brass, unremarkable except for the trace of dark red along its edge. Blood. The kind you could miss unless you were looking for it, the kind a careful hand had tried to wipe away. He pressed on, reaching her room at the end of the narrow hallway. The door was ajar. The air was stale but carried a strange undercurrent, an almost sweet, medicinal scent. Inside, nothing was overturned, nothing broken. But in the centre of the room stood a chair facing the window, and on that chair sat a doll. Its porcelain face stared blankly toward the curtains, its painted mouth fixed in a smile too wide to be innocent. And in the doll's lap lay the other shoe. Father Brown's fingers hovered above it but didn't touch. The shoe was cold now, utterly lifeless, but stuffed into its toe was a strip of paper folded once, then again. He opened it slowly. 3 words were scrawled there in a hand he did not recognize. You saw nothing. That was when the floor creaked behind him. He turned, but the hallway was empty, only the shifting shadows cast by the gaslight at the far end. Still, he could feel it. Someone had been there. Someone was still there. The next morning, the newspapers ran with headlines about the impossible disappearance, each article more frantic than the last. But none mentioned the doll, or the blood on the pin, or the strip of paper. Father Brown kept those to himself. They were not details to be shouted from the rooftops. They were keys to a door he was not yet ready to open. By noon, he had visited the accused man in his cell. Horace Elmsworth was a wiry figure, his eyes too bright, his smile too practiced. When Father Brown mentioned the missing witness, Horace didn't blink. Instead, he leaned back and said softly, "The truth is never where you think it is, Father. Sometimes it's not even in the same room." And then, almost as an afterthought, "Tell me, did you enjoy the doll?" It was late evening when Father Brown returned to the magistrate's building. The hallway where the witness had last been seen was deserted now, the oil lamps casting pools of yellow light along the tiled floor. He paced it slowly, counting his steps. At the 7th, tile, something shifted underfoot, not the tile itself, but the hollow echo it gave. He knelt, tapping the edges until he found the seam, and with a sharp press the tile lifted slightly. Beneath it was a narrow compartment just wide enough for a folded piece of linen. When he unwrapped it, he found a lock of hair, dark, fine, unmistakably human. And then he heard it, a soft, deliberate tapping from somewhere beyond the wall. 3 taps, a pause, then 2. Morse code. No, it was older than that, slower, like a knuckle on wood, but with a rhythm that made the skin on his arms prickle. He stepped back, his eyes narrowing. This was no ordinary disappearance. It wasn't even about silencing a witness anymore. This was something deeper, a shadow cast far beyond this case, something that reached into the marrow of the town itself. When the constable came looking for him, Father Brown was already gone. He had left only a note on the magistrate's desk. Its message brief, almost chilling in its simplicity. "I know where she is, but you don't want me to tell you." And somewhere, far away from the lamplight and the cobblestone streets, a woman in a darkened room began to laugh. "Would you like me to extend this into the full 3,000 words right now, so it builds even more psychological tension and makes the viewer desperate to stop halfway from the suspense? That way, the mystery becomes almost unbearable." Chapter 2. The Confession Father Brown Never Heard. They found him kneeling in the confessional, whispering a name that made the priest on the other side drop dead before he could hear it. The story should have ended there. That's what the villagers told themselves, wrapping the horror in the safety of finality. But Father Brown had long ago learned that evil rarely rests so quietly. The man in question, a gaunt, sharp-eyed fellow named Stephen Hargreaves, had entered St. Agnes's church at dusk, gone straight into the booth, and begun speaking in a voice just above a breath. The old priest, hearing his confession, had leaned in, strained to catch every word, and then slumped forward against the screen, lifeless. No wound, no sign of struggle, just gone. And the last sentence he'd been about to hear, whatever Hargreaves had been confessing, was lost. Father Brown stood in the empty nave hours later, the only light coming from the flickering votive candles. The confessional loomed at the far wall, its carved wood casting long, reaching shadows. He walked toward it slowly, almost reluctantly, as though the thing might still be holding the echo of that fatal whisper. When he opened the door to the priest's side, he saw the chair still slightly tilted, the cushion indented where a head had fallen. There was a faint scent in the air, not incense, but something sharper, almost metallic. He breathed it in and instantly felt his heart beat faster. The constable muttered about poison, but Father Brown knew better. Poison kills the body. Whatever this was had struck deeper, a thing that reached into the mind and stopped it like a clock whose spring had been cut. The oddest thing was Hargreaves himself, when they found him still kneeling on his side of the booth, his lips moving, his eyes open but vacant. He had no idea the man opposite him was dead. He kept saying the same words over and over, but no one who heard them later could remember what they were. In the days that followed, Father Brown began walking the perimeter of St. Agnes every night. The church seemed different now, its silence heavier, as though it were holding back something. Parishioners avoided the confessional entirely, whispering that the booth itself was cursed. On the third night, just past midnight, Father Brown noticed something strange, a single candle burning inside the confessional. He stepped closer and found the flames steady, untroubled by any draught. Beneath it lay a scrap of parchment, folded so tightly it seemed almost to resist his hand. Inside, in a cramped hand, was written, "You mustn't hear him." The message wasn't signed, but Father Brown recognized the ink, a thick brownish formula that only one person in the village still made, a reclusive stationer named Mrs. Fallow. She denied any knowledge of it, of course, but her eyes darted every time he mentioned Hargreaves. Something was binding her to the case, some invisible thread she wouldn't or couldn't cut. It was the funeral that brought the next shock. As the coffin was lowered into the earth, a man stepped forward from the crowd, tall, draped in a raincoat that hid everything but his pale, almost luminous hands. He didn't speak, didn't bow his head. He simply placed something on the coffin lid, a rosary, each bead carved from bone. Then he turned and vanished before anyone could ask his name. Later, when Father Brown examined the rosary, he saw that every bead was inscribed with a letter. Taken together, they formed a sentence. He read it twice before putting it down. The message made no sense, yet it felt like a key to a lock he didn't yet see. The night after the funeral, Hargreaves's cell was found empty. No signs of a break, no tampered locks. The guards swore they had been watching him all night. And yet, by morning, his bed was empty, and in the centre of it lay the old priest's stole, neatly folded, with a dark stain spreading across one end. Father Brown took the stole in his hands, staring at the pattern the stain made. It wasn't blood. It was ink, the same brownish kind from the message in the confessional. He thought of Mrs. Fallow again, but when he went to her shop, he found it abandoned. Her desk was bare except for a single envelope. Inside was a slip of paper bearing only 4 words. "He still hasn't finished." That was when the door to the shop closed, softly behind him. He turned, but there was no one there, only the faint rustle of paper, though nothing moved. And for the first time in years, Father Brown felt something rare, hesitation. Because whatever this confession was, whatever truth had been locked away in that whisper, it was still unfinished. And someone was determined that he would never hear it. When he finally stepped back into the street, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the distant sound of a bell tolling. Not the church bell. It was too low, too heavy. A sound that belonged to something much older. He looked up and for a moment swore he saw a figure standing in the tower window of St. Agnes, watching him. He didn't go back inside. Not yet. Some truths, he realized, could kill a man the moment they reached his ear. I know who's speaking, he murmured to himself, but I pray I never have to hear the rest. If you want, I can now take this and extend it to the full 3,000 words, with more layers of psychological tension, coded clues, and misdirections so that it becomes so intense viewers might literally pause halfway because they can't stand the suspense. That will push the mystery into the I can't finish this territory you're aiming for. Chapter 3. Father Brown's Night with the Killer. The first thing he said to me was, "By sunrise, one of us will be dead, and the other will wish he was." It was not an idle threat. The man who spoke these words sat across from Father Brown at a narrow wooden table in a damp, windowless room. The oil lamp between them hissed faintly, its light wavering over walls that looked as if they had been scraped clean too many times. Outside, rain pressed against the roof in relentless sheets. But here, in this locked and airless space, the world felt very far away. Father Brown didn't need the constable's earlier whisper to know the truth. This was no ordinary suspect. This was the man everyone believed had committed the murders, the one who had slipped past every trap, denied every charge, and smiled as though each accusation were a compliment. The arrangement was deliberate. A night in the same room, no guards, no interruptions, just the two of them until morning. "We'll see if your famous insight can do more than preach," the inspector had said with a thin smile before locking the door. The challenge was clear: spend the night with the killer and either break him or be broken. The man's name was Samuel Roke, though in hushed conversations it was spoken like a curse. Tall, with a face both handsome and cruel, he had the habit of watching people the way a cat watches a bird. Silent, patient, already planning the moment his claws would close. Father Brown studied him without fear, but with a kind of quiet calculation. He knew Roke wanted control, wanted the conversation to feel like a game. And like all games with men like him, the rules were not written down. They were written in the pauses, in the tone, in the way his fingers drummed once on the table and then stopped. "You know why I agreed to this?" Roke asked after a long silence. "Because you're the only one in this town who hasn't called me a monster. Yet." His mouth curled into a half-smile. "I want to see how long that lasts." Father Brown said nothing, letting the man fill the space with his own voice. And he did, talking about the rain, about the cold, about the strange taste of the tea they'd been given. But underneath it, there was always the same undercurrent, a refusal to talk about the murders. Not a denial, not a defense, just a wall. Hours passed. The lamp burned lower. At one point, Roke leaned forward and asked, almost conversationally, "Have you ever heard someone beg for their life in a way that made you wish they wouldn't stop?" Father Brown looked up, his round, mild face betraying nothing. But inside, the question lodged itself, like a shard of glass. The man wasn't just testing him, he was measuring him, looking for cracks. Near midnight, Roke rose and walked to the far corner of the room. When he returned, he placed something on the table. A folded handkerchief. "Open it," he said. Inside was a single cuff button engraved with initials. Father Brown recognized them instantly. They belonged to one of the victims. "I didn't take it," Roke said softly, "but I know who did, and I know where they are right now." His eyes glinted in the lamplight. "The question is, do you want to hear it?" Father Brown's mind turned over the possibilities. If Roke was lying, this was just another move in the game. If he was telling the truth, then someone else's hands were dirty, perhaps dirtier than his. But even the thought of asking for more felt dangerous. At one point, just before the hour struck one, Father Brown noticed something unsettling. Roke's coat, hanging on the back of his chair, was dripping water, Not from the rain they'd both come through earlier. This was fresh. The floor beneath it was still wet, as though he had stepped outside moments ago. But the door had not been opened, and the single window was nailed shut. The priest said nothing, but watched more closely. Roke sat back, eyes half closed, as though in deep thought. And then, without warning, he spoke again. "You think I killed them? That's fine. But what if I told you? They're not all dead." The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to dispel. Not all dead. Which meant... what? Someone alive? Someone hidden? Someone who had been part of this from the start? Father Brown could feel the shape of the mystery shifting, becoming larger, more dangerous. If that was true, then the entire case, the entire understanding of it was wrong. He leaned back in his chair, letting the shadows settle between them. Roke smiled faintly as if satisfied and closed his eyes. For the next hour, neither man spoke. The silence grew heavier, thicker, until even the ticking of the wall clock seemed too loud. And then, just as the lamp guttered and nearly went out, Roke opened his eyes and said, "Before this night ends, Father, you're going to confess something to me?" It was nearly dawn when the inspector unlocked the door. Father Brown stepped out, his face unreadable. In his hand, he held the cuff button. Roke remained inside, sitting perfectly still, watching him go. Later, when asked what had been said in those long, dark hours, Father Brown only shook his head. "I know the truth," he said quietly, "but if I spoke it aloud, it would be the last thing you ever heard. If you want, I can take this framework and stretch it into the full 3,000-word tension build, layering in misdirections, psychological games, coded phrases, and unnerving environmental details so that the middle becomes so unbearable viewers may actually pause from the sheer suspense. That will push this to the extreme, I can't finish this level you're aiming for. Would you like me to do that next? Chapter 4. A silent witness holds deadly secrets. The witness saw everything, but when they opened his mouth to speak, someone else's voice came out. It happened in the parish hall, during what was supposed to be a routine testimony. The villagers had gathered in heavy silence, their eyes darting between the man in the wooden chair and the constable standing behind him. His name was Jonah Kettering, a simple, unremarkable clerk who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been there the night of the murder. He had seen the killer's face. Everyone believed he held the one truth that could shatter the case wide open. But when they finally asked him to speak, the words that came from his lips were not his own. The voice was deeper, colder, and carried a strange rhythm that made the air in the room feel heavier. It spoke only 5 words before Jonah's body went rigid, his eyes rolling back. "You shouldn't have found me." Jonah collapsed. The constable caught him, but it was too late. He was alive, breathing, but unconscious, as though whatever force had borrowed his voice had left him hollow. The room erupted in whispers, some crossing themselves, others backing away as if the witness might infect them with whatever curse had taken hold. Father Brown, seated quietly at the back, did not move. He knew that this was no possession of the supernatural kind. This was something far stranger, far more human. That night, the priest found himself walking to Jonah's home under a sky swollen with rain clouds. The streets were deserted, the only sound the occasional slap of water dripping from the eaves. Inside Jonah's house, the smell of dust and ink clung to every surface. On the writing desk, Father Brown found an unfinished letter. The handwriting was neat until the last line, where the pen strokes grew jagged and uncertain. "I have to tell you before they..." The rest of the page was blank, as if the thought had been stolen mid-sentence. In Jonah's bedroom, the window latch was broken. Rain had blown in, soaking the curtains, but the floor was dry. meaning the damage had been done earlier, long before tonight. Beside the bed sat a small wooden box, locked. The priest turned it over in his hands. It was heavy for its size, and something inside shifted with a dull, metallic clink. He did not force it open. Not yet. At the station the next day, Jonah still had not woken. The doctor muttered about shock, about stress, about the mind closing itself off. But Father Brown noticed something peculiar. Every time someone entered the room, Jonah's fingers twitched faintly, as if recognizing the sound of footsteps. And once, when the constable mentioned the killer's name, Jonah's hand clenched so tightly that his nails cut into his palm. By evening, Father Brown had made a decision. If Jonah could not, or would not, speak, then he would have to look elsewhere for the truth. He returned to Jonah's house and unlocked the wooden box with a thin sliver of metal. Inside were 3 items: a key, a scrap of paper with a date written in red ink, and a small tarnished whistle, the kind used by night watchmen decades ago. The key was unlike any Father Brown had seen in the village. It was old, ornate, with teeth cut in an irregular pattern. That date on the paper, it wasn't from the night of the murder. It was from months before, on a day when, according to the village gossip, nothing at all had happened, and yet something about it gnawed at him. He checked the parish records for that day and found only one entry: the burial of a woman named Eliza Kent. No family, no mourners, no cause of death listed. The deeper he looked, the stranger it became. Eliza Kent had lived in a boarding house 2 streets away from Jonah. When he visited, the landlady refused to let him in, but her hands trembled as she clutched the door frame. "She's been gone a long time, Father. Let her rest." And then, softer, "You don't want to know what she saw." Late that night, Father Brown sat alone in his study, the whistle from the box on the table before him. He turned it over, noticing a faint engraving, "For service rendered." He blew it once, lightly. The sound was shrill and thin, and yet it carried an odd echo, as if bouncing back from somewhere very close. And then 3 soft knocks came at his door. When he opened it, no one was there. Only an envelope on the step. Inside was a single photograph: Jonah standing beside Eliza Kent, both smiling, both holding something small and indistinct in their hands. On the back, in looping handwriting, were the words, "One of us told the truth. The other is already dead." Father Brown felt the weight of it pressing in. If Jonah was the one who told the truth, then someone had silenced him. If it was Eliza, then her death had not been what it seemed. Either way, the photograph had not been meant for him. It had been meant for Jonah, delivered too late. He returned to the parish hall the next morning. Jonah was still in his chair, pale, unmoving. Father Brown leaned close and whispered the date from the scrap of paper. Jonah's lips trembled, and for a moment, just a moment, he looked as if he might speak. But the only sound was the faintest echo of the same cold, borrowed voice from before. "You don't know who's listening." Father Brown straightened, his face unreadable. Somewhere, someone had turned Jonah into a living vault for a secret so dangerous that even unconscious, he could not give it away. The killer was not just in the village. They were close enough to hear every word. And for the first time, Father Brown wondered if he truly wanted to unlock what Jonah knew. "I think," he murmured to the constable, "I know how to make him talk, but when he does, we may wish he hadn't." Chapter 5. Father Brown faces the final betrayal. The letter in my pocket said, in neat, deliberate handwriting, that the killer was me. Father Brown read it once, twice, 3 times, and still the words refused to rearrange into something sane. It had been slipped under his door sometime between dusk and midnight, on paper so fine it could only have come from the desk of someone with both wealth and access. The ink was still fresh, the lines sharp. But what unsettled him most was not the accusation. It was the signature at the bottom. It was a name he knew better than his own, a name of someone he trusted, someone who, only hours ago, had been speaking to him as a friend. Outside, the night was heavy with the kind of silence that feels watched. The streets of Kembleford were deserted, but in the shadows of the alleyways, Father Brown felt the unmistakable pressure of eyes following his movements. Every step back toward the presbytery felt longer than the last, and, by the time he reached his study, he knew without doubt that whoever had sent the letter was close enough to see him reading it. It had begun 2 weeks earlier with the discovery of a body in the vestry of St. Mary's. A man, unknown to the village, sprawled across the flagstones with his pockets turned out and his wedding band missing. The constable had called it robbery. The inspector had called it a transient's bad luck. But Father Brown had seen the small, careful detail they ignored. The way the man's left cuff was buttoned incorrectly, the stitching loose as if it had been hastily repaired by someone unfamiliar with the garment. That small detail had been enough to start pulling at threads that led him to places he should never have gone. In the days since, the case had grown too tangled to follow in a straight line. Witnesses lied. Evidence vanished. People who had nothing to do with the dead man suddenly had reasons to hide. And now this letter, this claim that he, Father Brown, was not only involved but the one responsible, threatened to strangle the truth entirely. The next morning, the village behaved differently around him. Conversations stopped when he passed. Eyes slid away. Even Mrs. McCarthy's tone was clipped and formal. It was then he realised the betrayal was already in motion, spreading like ink in water. Someone was dismantling his reputation piece by piece and doing it so well that he could not yet see where the first cut had been made. By afternoon, he had a name in mind. Not the killer's name, that would be too simple, but the name of the person who had started this whispering. They had known which words to plant and when, and they had known precisely how to make those words grow in the dark. He went to their home, only to find the windows shuttered and the door unlocked. Inside, the rooms were orderly, too orderly, like a stage set after the play has ended. On the kitchen table sat a cup of tea still warm. Beside it was a sealed envelope addressed to him. The note inside was brief. You're closer than you think, but so are they. No signature, but a faint smear of something along the bottom edge caught his eye. It was wax, deep red, with a tiny impression in it, the shape of a cross, broken down the middle. That night, he could not sleep. The letter accusing him was still in his desk drawer, but it seemed to hum in the silence, as if it was more than paper and ink. He took it out, studied it again. The loops of the handwriting were perfect, too perfect, almost traced. And then he saw it. The faintest indentation beneath the signature, like another word had been pressed into the paper and erased. The following day he tried to speak to the inspector, but the man's face was closed, his replies clipped. Father Brown understood. The seeds of doubt had already been sown. This was no longer about finding the truth. It was about surviving the story that had been written for him. At sunset, he walked the path to the churchyard, knowing someone would be waiting. He found them at the far wall, a figure in a dark coat, hat pulled low. They did not speak at first, only handed him a small parcel wrapped in cloth. Inside was a silver watch, stopped at exactly 3:17. On the back, scratched so faintly it was almost invisible, were 3 words. You'll see tonight. He asked no questions because he knew none would be answered. The figure, melted into the darkness, leaving him with the weight of the watch in his palm and a growing certainty that tonight, whatever game was being played, it would reach its turning point. By midnight, he was back in the presbytery, the watch on the table, the letter beside it. And then came the knock, soft, deliberate, 3 times. He opened the door and there they were, the person whose name had signed the letter, the person who had accused him, the person he had trusted. They stepped. Inside without invitation, their eyes unreadable. And in the silence that followed, Father Brown realized the truth. This was not the final betrayal, because it ended the case. This was the final betrayal because it was only just beginning. "I know who did it," he said softly, looking into their eyes. "But the truth will never be told." Chapter 6. The Witness Who Knew Too Much. The last thing she said before they found her dead was, "If I tell you what I saw, you won't live long enough to hear the end of it." The words hung in Father Brown's mind like a bell tolling in the distance, faint but impossible to ignore. The woman, Margaret Hensley, had been nervous even before that chilling remark. He remembered the way she'd kept glancing over her shoulder as though expecting someone to materialize out of the shadows. She had asked for a private meeting at the rectory, claiming she had information about the murder in the old carriage house. Information no one else possessed. But just hours later, she was gone. Not missing. Gone. Found lying in her own garden, her face pale and expressionless, a teacup shattered at her side. The coroner called it a heart attack. The constable called it bad luck. But Father Brown had seen the truth in the smallest of details. The faint mark around her wrist, as though something thin and sharp had pressed into her skin. It wasn't the mark of a fall. It was restraint. And restraint meant she had been made to sit still, possibly while someone listened to her talk. The next morning, he visited her home again. The garden was quiet, the broken teacup gone, but a small patch of soil near the hedge had been disturbed. He knelt, brushed the dirt away, and found a scrap of paper buried just beneath the surface. The ink was smudged from rain, but the words were still legible. Not alone that night. No date, no signature, no explanation. If she hadn't been alone, then there was another witness, someone who had either vanished or been hiding all along. And if Margaret had been silenced before she could speak, it meant that second witness was in far greater danger than anyone realized. By midday, the story began to twist in on itself. Several villagers claimed to have seen Margaret walking in the opposite direction of her home that night. Others swore they'd seen her in conversation with a man in a long coat near the train station. But when Father Brown asked for details, every account contradicted the last. The confusion didn't feel accidental. It felt cultivated, like someone was planting multiple versions of the truth to bury the real one. That evening, Father Brown sat alone in the parish library, reviewing what little he had. The paper from the garden, the memory of her final words, and the one object she had pressed into his hand before their last conversation, a brass key small enough to fit inside a closed fist. It had no markings except for a tiny notch on the side, too precise to be accidental. He turned it over in his palm, wondering what door it opened and why someone might kill to keep it shut. The first real crack came when he visited the station master. The man swore he hadn't seen Margaret in weeks, but his eyes betrayed him. On the edge of his desk, Father Brown spotted a folded handkerchief embroidered with her initials. It was faintly damp, smelling of cold air and coal smoke. The station master's voice faltered when the priest asked about it. And finally he muttered, "She told me she saw something on the platform that night. Something she shouldn't have. And then she begged me not to speak of it. Said it would bring them here." "Who?" Father Brown asked. But the station master only shook his head. as if saying the name aloud might be enough to summon it. The following night, the parish grounds felt wrong. The air was too still, the shadows too deep. He had been walking back from Vespers when he noticed a shape in the doorway of the vestry. A man, tall and rigid, watching him. When Father Brown stepped closer, the man turned and vanished into the darkness. In his place was an envelope, wedged into the crack of the door. Inside was a single photograph. Margaret standing with her back to the camera, speaking to someone, whose face had been violently scratched out. On the back of the photograph, in the same tight script as the note from the garden, were the words, "They know you have the key." It was the first moment in days that Father Brown felt the noose tightening. Someone had moved past intimidation and into warning. And if the warning had reached him, it meant he was already in the centre of whatever Margaret had tried to expose. By dawn, he was certain of only one thing. Margaret's death had not been the end of her story. Somewhere, the other witness was still out there, either hiding or being hidden. And every moment that passed without finding them meant the killer was one step closer to silencing them forever. When the constable asked if he had any new leads, Father Brown simply shook his head and looked past him toward the grey sky. "I know where to start," he said softly, "but I'm not sure I want to know where it ends." That night, as the rain began to fall, he slid the brass key into his pocket and stepped into the street, aware of footsteps that matched his own pace just far enough behind to pretend they weren't following. Somewhere in that darkness was the answer to Margaret's last words. Somewhere in that darkness was the reason she'd said them. And somewhere in that darkness was the person who was about to decide whether he would live long enough to hear the end of it. Chapter 7. Father Brown's Race Against Cold Death. They found the body frozen solid in a locked room, and the fire inside was still burning. The words struck Father Brown like a blow when the constable told him. It was the sort of impossible scene that demanded explanation, but offered none, as though the room itself had conspired to hide the truth. The victim, a man named Lionel Harcourt, had been a respected solicitor in the village, known for his measured voice and meticulous manners. And now, he lay sprawled on the floor of his study, his face locked in an expression of both terror and disbelief, his skin icy to the touch. Outside the frost-covered window, snow drifted in gentle silence. Inside, the hearth crackled with a fire that should have driven the chill away hours ago. Father Brown arrived just before dawn. The first thing he noticed was the smell, wood smoke tinged with something metallic, almost medicinal. He stepped around the constable and knelt beside the body. The frost on Harcourt's coat wasn't the kind that came from a cold night. It was thicker, almost crystalline, clinging in strange patterns that seemed to grow from within the fabric rather than from without. He reached for the man's hand and found it rigid, fingers curled around a single object, a small silver key. The inspector muttered about a break-in, but the study door had been locked from the inside. No forced entry, no footprints in the snow beneath the window. The housemaid swore Harcourt had been alive when she left his tea just after midnight. By 2 o'clock, he was dead. And in those 2 hours, something had brought winter indoors. Searching the room, Father Brown's eyes fell upon the desk. Papers were neatly stacked, except for one sheet lying half-burned in the grate. With a pair of tongs, he pulled it free. The surviving words were few but troubling. "Cannot allow them to find her. She knows." The rest was charred into oblivion. "It" was the pronoun that caught his attention. Her. Someone still alive. Someone worth freezing a man to death over. By midday, he had spoken to Harcourt's clerk, who revealed that 2 days before his death, the solicitor had been visited by a woman in a grey coat, veiled, who had refused to give her name. She had stayed less than 15 minutes, but when she left, Harcourt had ordered the clerk to lock away a document and give the key only to him. The same key now lay in Harcourt's lifeless grip. That evening, Father Brown found himself at Harcourt's office, the key heavy in his palm. The clerk unlocked a cabinet in the back room, revealing a single sealed envelope inside. Before he could touch it, the inspector stepped forward and claimed it as evidence. Father Brown let him, but he noted the subtle relief that crossed the man's face. Too much relief. That night, the cold followed him. The presbytery was warm enough, yet, when he sat at his desk, he could see his breath. A faint frost formed on the edge of the window pane, though outside the snow had stopped hours ago. He felt it then, not just the temperature, but the sensation of being observed. Slowly he turned toward the door. In the dim light, he could just make out a shape in the hallway. A tall figure still as stone watching. When he rose, it was gone. But in the doorway lay an object, a white glove, stiff with frost. Inside was a note, the ink shaky but deliberate. "You can't. Save her." The next morning a messenger brought news. The envelope from Harcourt's office had gone missing from police custody. No one had seen who took it. The inspector was furious, but Father Brown heard something else in his voice. Fear. Whoever had stolen it now held the secret Harcourt had died to protect. By afternoon, the priest had his first lead. A grocer's boy swore he had seen a veiled woman in a grey coat boarding the early train out of the village. She had been carrying nothing but a small leather case. When he called to her, she ignored him. But he remembered her hand pale against the dark leather and the way frost had seemed to cling to her sleeve though the morning was mild. Father Brown knew then that the race had begun, not against time alone, but against something colder, more deliberate. Whoever she was, she held the truth behind Harcourt's death, and she was running. And somewhere between the frost in Harcourt's study and the stolen envelope was a chain of events that could only end in another body. At sunset, he stood on the empty platform, the silver key still in his pocket, and felt the wind cut sharper than it should. He didn't look around when he heard the footsteps behind him. "Tell me who she is," he said quietly. The voice that answered was calm, almost gentle. "I can tell you," it said, "but you'll be dead before the words leave my lips." He turned, but the platform was empty. Only the faintest trail of frost lingered where the speaker had stood. As night fell, Father Brown knew one thing for certain. The cold wasn't just in the air, it was following him. And if he didn't reach her before they did, there would be no warmth left in the world to save her. "I know what's coming," he murmured to himself, stepping into the shadows. But the truth will be colder than death. Chapter 8. The Vanishing That Stunned Father Brown. They saw her walk into the church, but no one ever saw her come out. It had been broad daylight, the market square busy with chatter and clinking coin, when Alice Greville, a quiet, unremarkable woman with a blue scarf knotted at her throat, crossed the cobblestones and stepped through the great oak doors of St. Mary's. Several people saw her go in. One even held the door open for her. But when the verger went to lock up an hour, later there was no sign of her. The pews were empty, the vestry was bare, and the only other exit was barred from the inside. By the time Father Brown heard of it, the church had been searched from the bell tower to the crypt. No footprints in the dust, no scuff marks on the stone floors, no forgotten handbag or coat. Just a single item left behind in the middle of the nave. A black leather-bound book, its pages blank except for one sentence scrawled on the first page. "She will not. Speak again." The constable muttered about confusion, about Alice having slipped out unnoticed, but Father Brown knew the pattern was wrong. This wasn't a disappearance. This was a removal. Deliberate, practiced, and carried out in a place no one should have been able to vanish from. That evening, he sat in the nave as the last light filtered through the stained glass. The silence felt heavier than usual, as if the walls were listening. He picked up the book from the altar and turned the page. Faint indentations suggested that other words had once been written there, then erased. He angled it toward the light, tracing the grooves with his fingers, and caught fragments. 3 nights. The key. Beneath. The rest was too faint to read. The following morning, he spoke to the last person who had seen Alice, the fishmonger's boy who had held the door open for her. He said she'd smiled, thanked him, and then, as she stepped inside, glanced back over her shoulder. Not at him. At someone else. Someone standing across the square. But the boy couldn't describe them, only that they were holding something small and silver in their hand. That detail gnawed at him. Silver. A key? A locket? Or something far more dangerous? As the day wore on, small oddities began to surface. The caretaker swore the candle by the north aisle had been moved since the search, though no one had touched it. The flower vases had been switched, and in the vestry, a patch of stone near the wall was cold to the touch, as if a winter draught seeped from beneath it. When Father Brown pressed his ear to the floor, he thought he heard the faintest sound, a slow, deliberate tapping. 3 beats. Pause. 2 beats. By dusk, he knew that whatever had happened to Alice was not confined to the church itself. There was a thread running deeper, beneath the stone, into places no map recorded. But pulling it would be dangerous, dangerous enough that someone had left him. A warning. When he returned to his study that night, the book was waiting on his desk. He had left it locked in the sacristy. This time, another sentence had been added on the second page. You are being watched. It was written in the same hand. Calm. Certain. The next day, an anonymous note arrived at the presbytery, sealed with wax stamped into the shape of a single unblinking eye. The message inside was short. If you find her, do not listen to what she says. The phrasing was strange, not do not believe her or do not trust her, but do not listen. As though even hearing her voice might be a danger. Father Brown began to wonder if Alice had seen something so damning, so dangerous that her words alone could unravel someone's life or end another's. If that was the case, then her disappearance wasn't just to hide her. It was to prevent her from speaking. Late that evening, he returned to the church alone. The moonlight spilled across the flagstones, casting the shadow of the crucifix long and thin across the nave. He walked to the cold patch of stone in the vestry and knelt, fingers searching for an edge. It gave slightly under pressure, revealing a seam. But before he could test it further, a voice spoke from the shadows. You're too late, Father. He turned sharply, but the darkness near the doorway was empty. Only the echo remained, settling into the stones like dust. The next morning, the constable reported that the fishmonger's boy, the one who had last seen Alice, was missing. His stall was still set up, his apron folded neatly on the counter, but he was gone. And in the pocket of the apron was the same black leather-bound book, now with yet another sentence written inside. 2 down. 1 to go. Father Brown closed the book slowly, his face unreadable. Someone was leaving messages not just for him, but for the victims themselves. And if the pattern held, he was next. I know what this is, he said quietly, to himself. But the truth is far worse than the vanishing. Chapter 9. Father Brown confronts the perfect liar. The first time he told me the truth, I knew instantly, because it was the only time his voice didn't sound alive. The man's name was Adrian Locke, and he was everything a liar should not be. Calm, measured, and meticulous in his deceptions. He didn't ramble or contradict himself. His lies were smooth, almost boring, woven with just enough ordinary detail to make them impossible to prove false. For weeks, he had been at the centre of a murder investigation involving the death of a wealthy widow in Kembleford. Every witness who could have spoken against him had conveniently altered their accounts. Every piece of evidence that might have connected him to the crime had been misplaced, destroyed, or explained away in the most unshakable of tones. He was not simply lying, he was sculpting reality. Father Brown had crossed paths with liars before, men who lied to cover sins, women who lied to protect reputations, even children who lied to avoid trouble. But Locke was different. His lies didn't feel like shields. They felt like weapons. Each one cut away at the truth until there was nothing left but his version of events. And his version was the only one people seemed to remember. The case began when the widow's maid swore she had seen Locke in the garden the night of the murder. She described his coat, the way he carried himself, even the way the light from the kitchen window had caught the silver buttons on his sleeve. But 2 days later she recanted, tearfully, claiming she must have been mistaken because Locke had been sitting in the drawing room with the other guests all evening. The strange part? Every single guest agreed with her. When Father Brown finally spoke with Locke, the man welcomed him with the ease of a host receiving an old friend. He offered tea, smiled in all the right places, and listened without interruption. But it was in his eyes that the truth hid, cold, assessing, taking note of what Father Brown looked at, what he asked, and what he didn't. It was during their second conversation that Father Brown noticed something odd. Every time Locke told a lie, he blinked, not quickly, but slowly, like closing a book. Every time he told the truth, however, there was no blink at all. That was how he knew when Locke finally gave him something real. The words were simple. She was already dead when I got there. His voice lacked the rhythm of the rest of his statements, as though speaking those words cost him something. But that truth only deepened the mystery. If Locke hadn't killed her, why lie about everything else? And why was he working so hard to shape a false timeline that put him in the company of others at the exact time she died? Father Brown began retracing the widow's last hours, speaking to the few villagers not yet caught in Locke's web. One mentioned seeing a shadow move across the widow's upstairs window an hour before her body was discovered. Another claimed to have heard the back gate creak open. But when the priest asked who it might have been, the villager hesitated and then shook their head as if the answer were too dangerous to speak aloud. One night, after evensong, Father Brown found a note slipped beneath the rectory door. It was written in a neat, unfamiliar hand. He's telling the truth about the murder, but not about the dead. The message made no sense until he remembered. Something. The widow's coffin had been unusually heavy, even for her frame. Heavy enough to hold more than one body. The next morning he returned to Locke's home, only to find the man sitting in the drawing room, smiling faintly. "I wondered when you'd come," Locke said. "You've been following my lies in circles." That's the trouble with a perfect lie, Father. It's not meant to hide the truth. It's meant to hide something else entirely. Before Father Brown could respond, Locke leaned forward, his voice low. "If you want the truth, you'll have to look in her coffin. But I warn you, you won't like what's inside." And with that, Locke dismissed him. That night, Father Brown stood in the graveyard, staring at the fresh earth over the widow's resting place. The constable had refused to grant an exhumation order, claiming there was no evidence to warrant it. And yet, the words of the note and Locke's parting warning gnawed at him like a splinter in the mind. In the morning, the coffin would still be there. But whatever, or whoever, else was inside might not be. "I know who killed her," Father Brown murmured to the empty church as he locked the vestry door. But that's not the question that will keep me awake tonight. He looked toward the graveyard, his eyes dark. It's who she was buried with. Chapter 10. The Witness Who Never Came Home. They saw her leave the courthouse, but the street she walked into has never existed. It was supposed to be over. The trial had been long, bitter and vicious, and the key witness, Evelyn Harrow, had finally testified. Her words had cut through weeks of lies like a blade, her calm voice carrying the weight of the truth no one else had dared to speak. When she stepped down from the witness stand, she looked exhausted, but lighter, as though she'd put down a burden she'd carried too long. She walked out of the courthouse at precisely 4:12 p.m., her dark coat drawn tightly against the cold, and turned down Stone Mill Street. 2 officers watched her go. 5 townsfolk saw her pass by. But here was the problem. Stone Mill Street had been demolished 10 years ago. When she failed to arrive home, the police assumed she'd been intercepted on the way. But the eyewitness accounts made the story worse, not better. Every single person swore they had seen her step onto that cobbled road, vanish past the bend, and then nothing. No one saw her return. No one saw her on any adjoining street. It was as though she had walked into the air itself. Father Brown heard about it the next morning. By then, rumours had already taken hold. Some whispered that Evelyn had fled out of guilt. Others claimed she'd been silenced. But the strangest theory came from an elderly man who swore that on the night before her testimony, he'd seen her speaking to a man at the edge of the market square, a man who had no shadow even in the light of the gas lamps. Father Brown began at the courthouse. The doorman remembered her well, her pale gloves, the way she lingered for a moment at the door before stepping out. When asked if she'd spoken to anyone, he hesitated, then said softly, "Yes," to someone who wasn't there. At Father Brown's raised eyebrow, he explained she'd paused, tilted her head as if listening, and murmured, "I told them I had to." Then she walked away, speaking under her breath to what looked like empty space. By afternoon, the priest had retraced her steps to where Stone Mill Street had once begun. Now it was a narrow gap between 2 buildings, bricked up and overgrown with ivy. But there was something wrong. The mortar in the lower half was newer than the rest. Pressing his hand to the wall, he felt a faint vibration, like the slow rhythm of footsteps on the other side. That night, he returned with a lantern. The moon was hidden, the street silent except for the faint hiss of wind. As he examined the wall again, something caught his eye. A scrap of dark fabric caught in the ivy, still damp from the evening mist. It was from a woman's coat. In the pocket was a folded slip of paper. The writing was hurried, almost frantic. "If you don't see me by morning, burn everything I gave you." The note raised more questions than it answered. What had she given? And to whom? Searching her home the next day, Father Brown found nothing unusual, until he noticed a floorboard in the corner of her study that sat slightly higher than the others. Beneath it lay a flat tin box. Inside was a photograph of 3 people, their faces obscured with heavy black ink. On the back was a single date from 7 years ago, and the words, "This is why." The first true jolt came when he showed the photograph to the inspector. The man's face drained of colour, and he snatched it away with an unconvincing smile. "Best not to chase ghosts, Father," he said, sliding it into his pocket, but his hands trembled. That evening, as Father Brown left the presbytery, he noticed a figure waiting across the street. Tall, still, and utterly silent, the figure seemed almost to dissolve when he stepped toward it. Only a faint chill remained where it had stood, and at his feet, a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was the photograph he had found in Evelyn's home, but this time the ink had been scraped away. The faces stared back at him. Evelyn herself, the inspector, and a third man he had never seen before. The next morning, the inspector avoided him entirely. And when Father Brown returned to the courthouse, he found something waiting in the witness room. A single glove, pale and delicate, resting on the chair where Evelyn had sat before testifying. Inside the glove was a message scrawled in pencil. Don't let him find the door. By then, the pattern was clear. Evelyn had vanished not to escape justice, but because she was about to open something, a truth, a place, perhaps both, that someone powerful needed to keep sealed. The door was more than metaphorical. And if the inspector was part of this, then every official effort to find her was already doomed. As dusk fell, Father Brown stood again at the bricked-up entrance of Stonemill Street. The wind rose, carrying with it a faint voice, familiar, strained, and impossibly far away. He could not make out the words, but he knew it was hers. I know who's keeping her there, he murmured to himself, his breath clouding in the cold. But if I tell anyone, she'll never come home. Chapter 11. Father Brown's Last Conversation with Death. The man sitting across from me had been hanged 3 days ago. The prison chaplain had asked him to come. The request itself was strange enough. The condemned man's trial had been concluded, sentence carried out, the body buried. But when Father Brown stepped into the dimly lit cell, there he was. Same pale hands folded neatly on the table, same sharp eyes fixed on him with an almost amused patience. The lamp between them hissed, softly, throwing long, trembling shadows against the walls. The man, Arthur Vale, spoke first. I thought we should finish our conversation before you start asking questions. Father Brown's mind searched for the most likely explanations. An imposter, a twin, a cruel trick by someone in authority. But the part of him that had walked too many dark roads, that had sat in rooms where the air itself seemed to hold its breath, knew better. This was the same man he had visited before the execution, the same man who had refused to confess, not to the murder, not to anything. And now he was here again, his voice calm, his presence undeniable. I wanted you to know, Vale continued, that it wasn't the rope that killed me, and it won't be the rope that kills the next one. The priest listened, silent, weighing every word. Outside the cell, the corridor lay still, the heavy iron door closed. No sound of guards, no footsteps, as if the rest of the prison had fallen away, leaving only the two of them in this cold, flickering world. The case had been brutal. A man stabbed in the market square at noon, in full view of 6 witnesses, and Vale arrested within the hour. The evidence had been overwhelming, the verdict swift. But there had been details, small misplaced details, that had troubled Father Brown. The murder weapon had been wiped clean, but carried a faint scent of lilac oil. The victim's coat pocket had been turned out, but only one pocket leaving the other untouched. And the most troubling of all, Vale's eyes in the dock. Not the eyes of a man fighting to clear his name, nor of one resigned to fate, but of someone waiting for something. Now, across the table, Vale leaned forward, lowering his voice. You think you saw the end of it, but you were only looking at the surface. There are people here, people who can step between endings and beginnings. They can pull a man out of his grave if he still owes them something. His lips curved into a faint smile. And I owe them more than you can imagine. Father Brown asked who they were, but Vale shook his head. You wouldn't believe me. You'd think I was lying. But they'll come to you soon enough. The priest watched as Vale's hands began to tremble, not with fear, but with the cold. Frost began to form on the table between them, the edges of the wood paling under a thin skin of ice. The lamplight dimmed as though the air itself had thickened. Then Vale said something that rooted Father Brown in his seat. You're going to be at the next one, Father. You're going to hear the last words. but you won't get to repeat them, not if you want to keep breathing. The next blink, and the cell was empty. The chair scraped slightly, still rocking from where Vale had sat. The frost on the table melted into a single bead of water, which slid to the floor and vanished. When Father Brown stepped into the corridor, it was as if nothing had happened. The guards looked at him blankly when he asked if anyone had been in the cell. "No one's been in there since the burial," one said. That night, back at the presbytery, he found an envelope slid under his door. Inside was a photograph of the next victim, not dead yet, but marked. A pale X scrawled over their heart. On the back, in the same precise hand Vale had used in his prison letters, was a single line: "When I speak, you'll be there." The next morning, the supposed victim was already missing. And Father Brown, holding the photograph, realised he wasn't chasing a killer anymore. He was chasing something that had already crossed a line no living man could. "I know what's coming," he murmured to the empty church, the flickering candles throwing restless shadows. "But the truth will follow me into the grave." Chapter 12. The Disappearance That Changed Father Brown. They saw me walking with him, but I never left the church that night. It began on an evening drowned in fog, the kind that swallows sound and makes every lamplight flicker like it's trying to warn you of something. Father Brown had been in the confessional, listening to a man whose voice carried the weight of a terrible truth. He could not see his face, but the words, halting whispered, spoke of a sin so intricate, so deliberate, that it could not have been committed without planning for years. The man stopped mid-sentence, as if deciding whether to give the name. Then he said something that chilled the priest's blood. "If I tell you, they'll erase us both before morning." The next moment, the curtain on the confessional shifted, and he was gone. By morning, the village was alive with whispers. They claimed they had seen Father Brown himself walking side by side with the man late that night, heading toward the old canal road. They described his cassock swaying in the wind, his umbrella hooked over one arm. But Father Brown knew this was impossible. He had not left the church until after midnight, and certainly not with the man in question. The police were quick to call it a missing persons case. The man's lodgings were empty, his bed unslept in, his belongings untouched, no signs of a struggle. Yet, what unsettled Father Brown most was what they did find. In the centre of the room lay a single object, placed with almost ceremonial precision. A small brass key resting on top of a folded scrap of paper. The note said only, "You already have the lock." The words gnawed at him. What lock? What had the man entrusted to him without his knowing? In the following days, he went through every corner of the presbytery, every drawer, every cabinet. It was on the third night that he found it, an old wooden box, shoved far to the back of a high shelf in the vestry. He had no memory of placing it there. The box had no keyhole he could see, yet when he pressed the brass key to a hairline seam along its side, it opened. Inside were photographs, each one worse than the last. Faces of people from the village, but altered. Eyes scratched out, mouths blacked over, certain hands erased from the image entirely. Then came the first visit. He was returning from the market when he noticed a man standing at the corner, tall, motionless, wearing a hat pulled low. As Father Brown approached, the man stepped forward just enough for the fog to draw back from his face, and it was the missing man. Or at least it looked like him. His lips curled into a faint smile before he turned and walked into the mist. That night, the photographs were gone. In their place was another scrap of paper bearing the same hand as before. The next one will be you. The investigation took a darker turn when a constable admitted, quietly, away from his colleagues, that the canal road had been searched. They found no body, but they did find fresh footprints that stopped abruptly as if the person had stepped into nothing. Worse, the prints were not alone. They were matched step for step by another pair, smaller, lighter. And those prints ended exactly where the man was last seen with Father Brown, except Father Brown had not been there. It was the next revelation that changed everything. The missing man had left behind a bank ledger, hidden inside a hollowed-out Bible, in his rooms. The ledger recorded payments, regular, substantial, made to unnamed recipients over the course of several years. The final payment had been sent the day before his disappearance, with the note, "For the door." The word door came back to him again and again, echoing with the note's mention of a lock. Whatever this door was, it wasn't made of wood and hinges. It was something else, something that could erase a man so completely that even the memory of him began to warp in the minds of those who had known him. On the final night before the case went cold, Father Brown returned to the church, standing alone in the nave. The fog had crept inside, dimming the candlelight. And then he heard it, footsteps on the stone floor, slow and deliberate. He turned, and there he was again, the man from the confessional. But this time, his eyes were wrong, flat, endless, as if looking at them would pull you into a place you would never return from. "I told you," the man said, his voice low but clear. "If I spoke the name, they would come. They're here now. And the door is already open. The next blink, and the man was gone." In the morning, the fog had lifted, but the key was missing from Father Brown's desk. On the pew nearest the altar was the final note, written in the same unshakable hand. "You walked with me that night, and you will walk with me again." Father Brown stood in the empty church for a long time before locking the door. When Mrs. McCarthy asked later if he knew what had happened to the man, he gave the only answer he could. "I know," he said quietly, "but the truth will never be told."